Hey guys, tonight we're wandering north, way north, into the strange, snowbound, suspiciously polite world of Canadian history. You think you know Canada, maple syrup, hockey, and apologising to furniture you bumped into. But the real story is far weirder. A country quietly stitched together by rum runners, a seance-obsessed prime minister, a bear named Winnie, and at least one explorer who ate his own boots and lived to brag about it. So before we get cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a sincere thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas are the whole reason this strange little channel keeps growing, and I really do read every single one. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Somehow it's always 2 a.m. somewhere. Oh, and we're now on Spotify too, so if you'd rather drift off with just my voice and no glowing screen, the link is waiting in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe tuck your feet in against the imaginary cold. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered whether a country this quiet could actually be this bizarre? Could a national hero really be a woman who walked 20 miles through enemy woods and then, a century later, ended up on a box of chocolates? Did a Canadian soldier honestly adopt a live bear cub and take it toward the trenches? Could a prime minister run an entire country while secretly asking his dead dog for advice? Would you survive a gold rush winter if the police wouldn't even let you cross the border without a literal ton of food strapped to your back? And who, exactly, steals $18 million worth of maple syrup? Well, congratulations. You've just crossed the border into the strangest, most understated nation history has ever produced. Mind the moose, respect the Mounties, and whatever you do, don't insult the syrup. Welcome to Canada, where the truth is stranger, colder, and far more polite than fiction. Picture a woman in 1813, her long skirts dragging through mud, walking nearly 20 miles across swamp, forest, and enemy-patrolled backwoods to warn British soldiers that the Americans were coming. No horse, no map, no snacks, just sheer determination and, according to legend, a wandering cow for cover. Her name was Laura Secord, and her exhausting cross-country trek helped tip a battle in the War of 1812. Her reward? Almost nothing, for decades. Then, a full century later, a candy company quietly slapped her name on a box of chocolates, and that, dear listener, is how most Canadians know her today, not as a daring spy, but as dessert. Let's back up to how she ended up on that walk in the first place. Laura was living in the Niagara region, which during the war had the misfortune of being the neighbourhood everyone wanted to fight over. American troops had occupied the area, and a few officers, in a move that would come back to haunt them, decided to billet themselves right inside the Secord home and talk shop over dinner. Big mistake. Because while they loudly plotted a surprise attack on a British outpost, Laura was in the next room, quietly memorising every word like the world's most unassuming eavesdropper. Her husband James, still limping from a wound he'd taken at an earlier battle, was in no shape to travel, so Laura decided she would simply go herself. Now, 20 miles doesn't sound like much until you remember there were no roads worth the name, no sensible route, and a very real chance of being stopped by soldiers who would not be charmed by a woman claiming to be out for a casual stroll. So she went the long way, through woods, across streams, up muddy hills, in the kind of shoes that were basically decorative. She left before dawn and walked the entire day. By the time she reached the British outpost, her feet were wrecked, her clothes were soaked, and she looked less like a heroic messenger and more like something the swamp had rejected. The legend says that to slip past American sentries, she drove a cow along with her, pretending to be just a farm wife chasing after wayward livestock. Historians aren't sure the cow was ever real, but it's such a good detail that everyone secretly hopes it was. What matters is that she got there. She delivered her warning to Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon, and days later the British and their indigenous allies were ready and waiting when the Americans arrived. The attack that was supposed to be a surprise turned into a defeat instead. Laura Secord had, with nothing but her own 2 feet, quietly changed the outcome of a battle, and her thanks for all this? A resounding silence. For most of her life, virtually no one knew what she'd done. Fitzgibbon eventually wrote a note confirming her story, but recognition trickled in painfully slowly. It wasn't until she was an old woman, in her 80s, that the visiting Prince of Wales heard her tale and sent her a modest sum of money, the closest thing to a national thank you she ever received while alive. She died not long after, largely forgotten. Then history did what history loves to do. It turned her into a brand. Decades later, a chocolate company adopted her name and image as a symbol of courage and old-fashioned virtue. And so a woman who once trudged 20 miles through enemy territory to save an army became, in the end, the friendly face on a box of creams and caramels. Somewhere, Laura is either deeply flattered or absolutely furious. In 1914, a Canadian soldier named Harry Colborne was on his way to fight in the First World War when he did something no reasonable person should ever do at a train station. He bought a live bear cub. He named her Winnie, short for Winnipeg, and smuggled her along as a regimental mascot, because apparently a war wasn't chaotic enough without a bear in the barracks. When duty finally called him to France, he left Winnie at the London Zoo, where a small English boy named Christopher Robin fell completely in love with her. That boy's father happened to be a writer named A. Milne, and the rest, as they say, is one very cuddly accident of history. Let's rewind to the train platform where this delightful mistake began. Harry Colborne was, of all things, a veterinarian, a man whose entire profession revolved around the sensible care of animals, which somehow makes what he did next even funnier. He was travelling east with his cavalry unit, heading toward the war, when the train stopped at a station in White River, Ontario. There, on the platform, sat a hunter with an orphaned black bear cub he'd caught after its mother was killed. Any reasonable soldier bound for the trenches of Europe would have said, "What a shame," and moved along. Harry paid the man $20 and took the bear. He named her Winnie, after his hometown of Winnipeg, and just like that the regiment had a mascot. And not a symbolic one, an actual living bear who travelled with the troops, slept in Harry's tent, and by every account behaved less like a wild predator and more like an enormous, mischievous dog. She followed him around, ate from his hand, and became the unofficial sweetheart of the entire brigade. Imagine the morale meeting where someone had to gently explain that yes, the unit's emotional support animal was a bear, and no, she was not up for discussion. Winnie sailed with Harry across the Atlantic to the Army's training grounds in England, where she continued her career as the world's most beloved distraction. But then reality arrived, as it always does. Harry received orders to head to the front lines in France, and a battlefield is no place for a bear, not even one this charming. So before he shipped out, he made the painful decision to leave Winnie at the London Zoo, fully intending to collect her once the war was over. Here's the thing about the London Zoo. It's full of visitors, and Winnie, gentle and tame and entirely unbothered by crowds, quickly became one of its most popular animals. Children were even allowed to feed her and ride on her back, which tells you both how sweet she was, and how relaxed everyone was about safety in those days. Among the many small admirers who fell for her was a boy named Christopher Robin Milne. He adored that bear so completely that he renamed his own stuffed teddy after her. And Christopher Robin's father happened to be a writer named A. Milne, who had a habit of spinning his son's toys and adventures into stories. So the teddy bear named after the real bear named after a Canadian city became the star of a series of children's books. A soft, honey-obsessed, philosophically confused little creature named Winnie the Pooh. Harry, meanwhile, survived the war, but when the time came, he made a quiet, generous choice. He saw how happy Winnie was and how loved she'd become, and he let her stay. She lived out her days in London, a Canadian black bear who became the most famous bear in the history of the world without ever knowing it. So the next time you see a chubby yellow bear with his head stuck in a honey pot, remember he traces all the way back to a real cub, bought for $20 off a train platform in northern Ontario by a veterinarian who absolutely should have known better. In the frozen winter of 1931, a silent stranger drifted into Canada's Arctic, built himself a tiny fortress of a cabin, and began answering every polite question with gunfire. When the Mounties came knocking, he shot one of them and vanished into the 50 below darkness. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in Canadian history, a chase across hundreds of frozen miles involving dog sleds, radios, and even a bush plane, which frankly felt like cheating. The man they called the Mad Trapper never said a single word they could trust, and to this very day, nobody knows who he actually was. Let's step into that world for a moment, because it's hard to overstate how remote and unforgiving it was. This was the far northwest of Canada, deep in the subarctic, where winter meant weeks of darkness and temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Into this landscape wandered a quiet man who called himself Albert Johnson. He didn't chat, he didn't make friends, and he paid for things with cash he seemed to have plenty of, which was unusual for a drifter in the middle of nowhere. He built a small, sturdy cabin along the Rat River and mostly kept to himself, which would have been perfectly fine, except locals began complaining that someone was tampering with their trap lines. When the police went to have a reasonable conversation about it, Johnson refused to even open the door, so they came back with a warrant. This time, as an officer approached the cabin, Johnson answered through the wall with a bullet, wounding the constable, and that was the moment a minor trapping dispute became a legend. The Mounties returned in force, hauled in dynamite, and blew apart his cabin, fully expecting to dig a body out of the wreckage. Instead, they found nothing. Johnson had survived the blast, slipped out, and disappeared into the frozen wilderness like a ghost. What came next was a manhunt unlike anything the North had ever seen. Dozens of men, dog teams, and pursuers chasing a single silent fugitive across hundreds of miles of mountains and frozen rivers in the dead of an Arctic winter, while he somehow stayed ahead of every one of them. He wasn't just running either. He was good, unnervingly good. He climbed a mountain range in a blizzard to throw them off. He backtracked in his own snowshoe prints to scramble the trail. He survived off the land in conditions that would kill most people in a single night. During the chase, he shot and killed one of the officers pursuing him, which only raised the stakes and the fury of the hunt. The wilderness was so vast and Johnson so elusive that the Mounties eventually did something never before done in a Canadian manhunt. They called in an airplane. A famous bush pilot named Wop May took to the skies to track Johnson's footprints from above, the 1930s version of switching on satellite surveillance. From the air, they could finally follow the trail this phantom left in the snow. The chase ended on the ice of the Eagle River. Cornered at last, Johnson turned and fought, and in the final shootout, he was killed. And when they searched his body, the mystery only deepened. He was carrying a substantial amount of cash and some gold, but no identification, no letters, nothing to say who he was or where he'd come from. Nobody in the region recognised him. To this day, Albert Johnson is almost certainly not his real name, and despite decades of investigation, including, much later, exhuming his remains for forensic testing, his true identity remains unknown. He appeared out of nowhere, terrorised the Arctic for 6 weeks, outran an army across the frozen top of the world, and died without ever telling a soul who he was. Meet William Lyon Mackenzie King, the longest-serving Prime Minister in Canadian history, a shrewd political survivor, and a man who quietly ran the country while consulting the dead. Behind closed curtains, King held seances, gazed into crystal balls, and sought guidance from his deceased mother, assorted historical figures, and, yes, his beloved little dog. He read hidden meaning into the position of the hands on a clock and believed the universe was constantly leaving him tiny signs. Voters had no idea. They thought they had elected a dull, cautious bureaucrat. They had, in fact, elected a man politely asking a ghost terrier for advice. To be clear, this wasn't some minor eccentric hobby he dabbled in between meetings. King led Canada on and off for over 2 decades, longer than any other prime minister in the country's history, and longer than nearly any leader in the entire Commonwealth. He steered the nation through the Great Depression and the Second World War. He was, on paper, the very picture of grey, careful, buttoned-up competence. He never married, kept meticulous diaries, and gave off the energy of a man who alphabetized his sock drawer. And that public dullness was in a way the perfect disguise. Because in private, King's inner life was a swirling fog of the supernatural. He was a devoted spiritualist who genuinely believed he could communicate with the dead. He attended seances, sat with mediums, and took part in table rapping sessions where he believed departed souls were tapping out messages from beyond. He was especially devoted to reaching his late mother, whom he adored with an intensity that borders on the uncomfortable, and he believed she continued to watch over and guide him from the other side. His list of spectral consultants didn't stop there. He believed he received counsel from long-dead political greats, historical figures, and assorted relatives who had passed on. And yes, famously, he was deeply attached to his little Irish terrier, and when the dog eventually died, King mourned him like a member of the family and believed he could still sense his presence. Over the years, he kept a series of these terriers, each treated with the sort of tenderness most people reserve for children. Then there were the signs. King saw hidden meaning absolutely everywhere. If the hands of a clock happened to line up perfectly when he glanced at it, that was significant. If he woke at a particular hour, that meant something. He read tea leaves, consulted a crystal ball, and searched for patterns in numbers the way the rest of us search for our keys. Reality to him was a constant stream of gentle nudges from the beyond. Now, before you imagine him governing by asking a Ouija board whether to raise taxes, here's the genuinely remarkable part. Almost none of this leaked out while he was alive. In public, he governed with such caution and pragmatism that voters saw only the boring bureaucrat. He kept his mystical life almost entirely separate, poured into the pages of his private diary. His colleagues had hints, whispers, the occasional raised eyebrow, but the full glorious scope of it stayed hidden. It only truly came out after his death, when historians got their hands on those diaries and discovered that the dull, dependable man who had led Canada through its most dangerous years had also been quietly holding seances and seeking the approval of his dead mother and departed dog. It raises a question that is honestly kind of delightful to ponder as you drift off. How many of his careful, measured, historically praised decisions were shaped, even a little, by a man staring into a crystal ball at midnight, waiting for a sign? We'll never fully know. King took the details to his grave, though knowing him, he probably assumed he'd just keep the conversation going from the other side. Somewhere in Quebec sits a warehouse full of maple syrup so valuable it's called the Strategic Reserve, because Canada, being Canada, stockpiles syrup the way other nations stockpile oil, and between roughly 2011 and 2012, thieves quietly siphoned off nearly $18 million worth of the sticky gold, refilling some of the emptied barrels with water so no one would notice. It became one of the largest thefts in Canadian history, involving forklifts, fake barrels, and an almost heroic level of patience. Somewhere out there, a criminal mastermind looked at an entire lake of pancake topping and thought, yes, that's the one. First, let's appreciate the beautifully Canadian setup that made this heist possible. Quebec produces the overwhelming majority of the world's maple syrup, and to keep prices stable, the province's producers actually maintain a strategic reserve, an enormous stockpile of barrels held back in good years to release in lean ones. It is, and I cannot stress this enough, exactly like a national oil reserve, except the precious resource inside is the stuff you put on waffles. Millions of pounds of it, sitting quietly in a warehouse, aging like the world's stickiest wine. Now, a stockpile that valuable ought to be guarded like a bank vault. It was not. The reserve sat in a large facility watched over by nothing close to the security such a treasure deserved. And someone noticed. Over the course of roughly a year, thieves began quietly draining it. They would take barrels, siphon out the syrup, and in many cases refill the emptied barrels with water before setting them neatly back in place. From the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. Rows and rows of full, heavy barrels, all present and accounted for. The operation was patient and organised. The syrup was trucked out and funneled onto the black market, sold through shady buyers and shipped across borders to be resold as legitimate product. Because here's the thing about maple syrup. Unlike stolen jewels or a famous painting, syrup is untraceable and endlessly sellable. Nobody inspecting a pancake house's pantry is going to ask a bottle of syrup for its life story. It was, in a strange way, the perfect crime. Liquid, valuable, and utterly anonymous. By the time it all unravelled, the thieves had made off with nearly $18 million worth of syrup, one of the largest thefts in the history of Canada, and quite possibly the sweetest heist in the history of anywhere. And how was it finally discovered? Not through brilliant detective work or a high-tech alarm. It came apart because an inspector doing a routine check climbed up on the stacked barrels and nearly toppled because one of them, which should have been full and heavy, was suspiciously light. Tap, tap, hollow. That one wobbly barrel pulled on a thread that unravelled the whole scheme. When investigators started checking, they found barrel after barrel filled with water instead of gold. The fallout was enormous. A sprawling police investigation followed, dozens of people were arrested, and the ringleaders were hauled into court and handed serious prison time and eye-watering fines. Some of the stolen syrup was recovered. A great deal of it was long gone, presumably drizzled onto breakfasts across the continent by people who had no idea they were eating stolen goods. The whole affair became instantly, gloriously legendary. A story so absurd it sounds invented. A strategic national syrup reserve. A slow-motion inside job. Barrels refilled with water. A crime uncovered by one wobbly container. So the next time you tip a bottle over your morning stack, appreciate that you are handling a substance so valuable, people once orchestrated a multi-million-dollar conspiracy to steal it by the truckload. In most countries, the great heists involve banks or diamonds. In Canada, the crime of the century involved pancake topping. Before he vanished into the Arctic forever, Sir John Franklin earned one of history's least flattering nicknames, the man who ate his boots. On an earlier expedition, he and his starving men were reduced to boiling and gnawing on their own leather footwear just to stay alive. You'd think that would be enough Arctic for one lifetime. It was not. Years later, he sailed north again with 2 ships and well over 100 men, and this time the ice kept every last one of them. What happened out there, the slow starvation, the desperation, the dark whispers of cannibalism, stayed frozen and hidden for well over a century. Let's start with the boots, because it's the detail no one forgets. On an early expedition, Franklin led a party overland through the Canadian North to map a stretch of Arctic coastline. It went catastrophically wrong. Supplies ran out, the weather turned murderous, and the men found themselves starving in one of the emptiest places on Earth. They ate lichen scraped off rocks, a grim, barely edible moss, and when even that ran short, they boiled and chewed the leather of their own boots, choking down their footwear simply to keep something in their stomachs. Many of the party died. Franklin survived, staggered home, and returned to Britain not as a failure, but as a celebrity, complete with that darkly charming nickname. You would think a man who had literally eaten his shoes to survive the Arctic might, upon reflection, decide that he and the Arctic should quietly start seeing other people. But no, exploration was glory. Glory was everything, and Franklin wanted more of it. So years later, older now and comfortably out of shape, he was handed command of the most ambitious Arctic expedition Britain had ever launched, to finally chart the fabled Northwest Passage, the long-sought sea route through the top of the continent. He set out with two sturdy ships, the Erebus and the Terror, names that in hindsight feel a little too on the nose, and a crew of well over 100 men. The ships were stocked with everything the era considered cutting edge. Tons of tinned food, libraries of books, fine china, even an early steam heating system. It was a floating symbol of imperial confidence, sailing north into the ice, utterly certain of success. The ice was not impressed. Somewhere in the frozen maze of the Arctic islands, the ships became trapped, locked solid in pack ice that refused to release them through one winter and then another. Franklin himself died out there, though exactly when and how remains murky. The survivors, running out of food and hope, eventually abandoned the ships and set off on foot across the ice and tundra, dragging heavy boats and belongings behind them, trying to walk their way to safety through a landscape with no mercy in it. Not one of them made it. The entire expedition, every last man, vanished. For years, no one in Britain knew what had happened. Search parties were sent, rewards offered, and slowly the grim truth emerged, largely from Inuit witnesses who had encountered the desperate dying men and later found their remains. Those accounts included a detail Victorian Britain absolutely did not want to hear, that in their final starving days, some of the men had resorted to cannibalism. The establishment recoiled and tried to dismiss it, but much later forensic examination of the recovered bones revealed cut marks consistent with exactly that. The Inuit, it turned out, had been telling the truth all along. And the ships? They stayed lost for well over a century and a half, the subject of legend and obsession, before modern searchers, guided in no small part by Inuit oral history pointing them to the right waters, finally located the wrecks resting on the seabed, remarkably preserved in the cold. The Erebus was found first, and the Terror a couple of years later. So Franklin achieved a strange sort of immortality after all, not as the hero who conquered the passage, but as the man who ate his boots, sailed back into the ice that nearly killed him, and led over 100 men to disappear so completely that finding them became one of history's great cold cases. Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's very first Prime Minister, was a brilliant political architect and by nearly every honest account a spectacular drunk. The most famous story has him staggering onto a debate stage, turning a delicate shade of green and vomiting in front of the entire crowd. When his horrified opponent paused, Macdonald reportedly wiped his mouth and calmly explained that it wasn't the liquor at all. It was simply that his rival's speech had been so nauseating it made him physically ill. The crowd roared. He won. Somehow, being drunk and quick-witted became part of the founding personality of an entire nation. To understand the man, you have to understand his relationship with the bottle, which was less a habit and more a lifestyle. MacDonald was the chief architect of Canada itself, the shrewd, silver-tongued politician who stitched the country together and served as its first prime minister. He was brilliant, funny, and strategically ruthless. He was also, with cheerful regularity, absolutely hammered. His drinking was so well known that it was practically part of his political brand, and rather than hide it, he leaned into it with the confidence of a man who knew his charm could survive almost anything. There are countless stories, but the crown jewel is the debate. As the tale goes, MacDonald appeared before a crowd to spar with a political opponent, having apparently fortified himself beforehand rather too enthusiastically. As his rival spoke and MacDonald rose to respond, the combination of nerves, motion, and whatever he'd been drinking caught up with him all at once, and he was suddenly, violently sick, right there in front of everyone. It's the kind of moment that would end most political careers on the spot, but MacDonald was not most politicians. Without missing a beat, he wiped his mouth, gestured toward his opponent, and delivered a line for the ages, explaining that it wasn't drink that had made him ill at all. No. It was that every time he was forced to listen to his opponent's dreadful speeches, his stomach simply revolted. He hadn't been overcome by liquor, he'd been overcome by the sheer awfulness of the other man's ideas. The crowd naturally went wild. In one filthy, quick-thinking instant, he had transformed a humiliating disaster into a devastating insult aimed squarely at his rival. He turned his own vomit into a punchline, and the punchline into applause. That is a level of composure that cannot be taught. Whether every detail of the story is perfectly accurate or has been polished over the generations is hard to say. Legends have a way of improving with age. But it fits the man so perfectly that it has become part of the national mythology, and it's rooted in a very real truth. MacDonald genuinely was famous for public drunkenness, and genuinely did keep getting elected anyway. Voters knew exactly what he was. They knew he drank too much. They knew he could be a mess, and they kept handing him the keys to the country regardless, because he was also the cleverest man in nearly any room he stumbled into. There's a certain honesty to it that's almost refreshing. In an age where politicians work desperately to appear flawless, here was a founding father who was visibly, famously imperfect, a man who could be sick on a stage and still win the argument. So when you picture the dignified father of a nation, all stern portraits and noble founding moments, remember that the real man was just as likely to be swaying slightly, glass in hand, ready to weaponize his own hangover against you. Canada wasn't founded by a marble statue. It was founded in part by a quick-witted, hard-drinking charmer who once threw up in public and somehow made it his opponent's problem. In the 1920s, a Canadian military officer nicknamed Buster Brown sat down and drafted something genuinely unhinged, a detailed plan for Canada to invade the United States. Officially called Defense Scheme Number 1, it imagined small, fast-moving Canadian columns racing across the border to seize American cities and cause chaos before the Americans could organize. Roughly the strategic equivalent of ringing the doorbell and sprinting away. The whole idea was to buy time until the British could arrive. It was never used, thank goodness. But for a few years, tucked quietly in a filing cabinet, Canada's gentle reputation was hiding a shockingly cheeky war plan. Let's meet the mind behind the madness. Buster Brown was a senior Canadian military planner in the years after the First World War, and it was his job to think about how Canada might defend itself if things ever went badly with its enormous, powerful neighbour to the south. Now, most people in that role might have drawn up cautious defensive plans. Fortify the border, prepare to hold the line, that sort of thing. Brown looked at the map, considered the situation, and arrived at a much bolder conclusion. The best defence was a swift, aggressive, and frankly audacious offence. His creation laid out what Canada should do the moment war with the United States seemed likely. The core idea was speed. Canada could never hope to win a straight fight against the Americans. The difference in size and industry was laughable. But Brown reasoned that Canada could buy precious time. The plan called for fast-moving flying columns of Canadian troops to surge across the border immediately, before the Americans could fully mobilize and seize key cities in the northern United States. The target stretched across both coasts and the interior, grab them fast, cause maximum disruption, and force the enemy onto the back foot. The goal was never actually to conquer the United States, which would have been absurd. The goal was delay. By striking first and throwing American plans into chaos, Canada would stall an invasion long enough for the mighty British Empire to rally, cross the ocean, and come to the rescue. It was less a plan to win a war and more a plan to survive the opening rounds of one, a preemptive punch to the nose, followed by a strategic sprint back home. And Brown didn't just scribble this on a napkin and file it away. He took it seriously. He personally travelled into the United States on quiet reconnaissance trips, posing as an ordinary visitor while sizing up roads, bridges and cities, gathering the sort of information his flying columns would need. Picture a Canadian officer casually touring American towns, nodding pleasantly at the locals, all while mentally noting the fastest route to occupy the place. It is equal parts alarming and hilarious. For a few years, this document genuinely existed as official Canadian military thinking. The country with the international reputation for politeness, apologies, and mild-mannered decency had, tucked away in a drawer, a real blueprint for storming across the border and grabbing American cities by surprise. Of course, it was never anything close to realistic, and cooler heads eventually prevailed. As relations with the United States settled and the idea of an American invasion came to seem thoroughly ridiculous, the plan was quietly shelved and eventually scrapped altogether. It's worth noting the Americans, for their part, apparently kept their own theoretical plan for invading Canada, so at least the awkwardness was mutual. But Defence Scheme Number 1 remains one of the great surprises of Canadian history, precisely because it clashes so completely with the image the country loves to project. It's the diplomatic equivalent of discovering that the quietest, most agreeable person at the party once mapped out, in careful detail, exactly how they'd rob everyone's house. During the First World War, Canada's Minister of Militia, Sam Hughes, fell in love with a truly inspired invention, a shovel with a hole punched through the middle. The idea was that a soldier could dig a trench with it, then flip it upright, poke his rifle through the hole, and use it as a bulletproof shield. Genius, surely. Except it was too heavy to dig properly, far too flimsy to actually stop a bullet, and the hole cheerfully let in dirt, wind, and disappointment. Tens of thousands were produced. Nearly all of them were eventually sold off as scrap metal, a lusting monument to confident, patriotic nonsense. To fully appreciate this, you need to understand Sam Hughes, a man whose confidence vastly outpaced his judgment. As the government minister in charge of Canada's military at the outbreak of the war, Hughes had enormous power over what equipment the troops received, and he had a real weakness for pet projects, inventions he was personally convinced were brilliant, regardless of what anyone with actual battlefield experience thought. The shield shovel was his crown jewel of misplaced enthusiasm. The concept, credited to a design his secretary helped patent, was seductively simple on paper. A soldier in the field has two big needs. He needs to dig himself protective cover, and he needs to shield himself from enemy fire. So why not fold both into one clever tool? Take a sturdy metal shovel, cut a small hole near the top of the blade, and now your digging tool doubles as a portable shield. Just prop it up, poke your rifle barrel through the hole, and fire away in complete safety while the steel stops incoming bullets. Two problems, one elegant solution. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Absolutely everything went wrong. The first issue was that in order to be even remotely bulletproof, the shovel had to be made of fairly thick metal, which made it heavy and awkward. Exactly the qualities you don't want in a tool a soldier has to lug for miles. The second issue was that it wasn't actually bulletproof anyway. When tested against real rifle fire, the blade did a wonderful impression of tinfoil, with bullets punching straight through it. So it failed as a shield. Then there was the hole. That clever little rifle port meant the shovel now had a gap right in the middle of the blade, which, as anyone who has ever used a shovel could have told you instantly, makes it a genuinely terrible shovel. Try digging a trench with a spade that has a hole in it, and you'll spend most of your time watching dirt sift right back through onto your boots. So it failed as a shovel too. To recap, Hughes had enthusiastically commissioned a device that was too heavy to carry comfortably, too flimsy to stop a bullet, and too holy to dig properly. It managed the remarkable feat of being worse at both of its jobs than two separate ordinary tools would have been. And yet, buoyed by confidence and patriotism, the order went ahead. Tens of thousands of these things were manufactured and shipped across the ocean to equip Canadian soldiers. The troops, being practical people who valued their lives, took one look and were entirely unimpressed. The shovels were quietly set aside as useless. In the end, nearly the entire batch was gathered up and sold for scrap metal, recouping a tiny fraction of what had been spent. The Great Shield shovel, hailed as a stroke of genius, ended its life as a pile of junk melted down for something more sensible. It stands as a perfect little parable about the danger of a powerful person who's more in love with his own cleverness than with actually listening to the people who would have to use his invention. Sam Hughes was certain he'd solved warfare with a hole and a shovel blade. What he'd actually invented was an object so uselessly ambitious it couldn't manage either of the two simple tasks it was built for. On a cold December morning in 1917, in the busy harbour of Halifax, two ships did the unthinkable and collided. One of them, the Mont Blanc, was packed to the brim with wartime explosives. What followed was the largest man-made explosion the world had ever seen. A blast so violent it flattened entire neighbourhoods, hurled a ship's anchor for miles, and briefly emptied part of the harbour of its water. It would hold that grim record right up until the atomic bomb. Thousands of people died in a single instant, and a quiet Canadian port became, for one terrible heartbeat, the loudest place on the entire planet. Let's slow down and walk into that morning, because the details are staggering. Halifax was a crucial wartime port, its harbour crowded with ships coming and going, ferrying troops and supplies across the ocean to the war in Europe. Among the vessels moving through the narrow channel that day was the Mont Blanc, a French cargo ship loaded almost beyond belief with high explosives, thousands of tons of the most dangerous materials imaginable, essentially a floating bomb sailing quietly through a busy harbour, full of people who had no idea what she carried. Coming the other way was another ship, the Imo. In the confined waters of the Channel, through a series of miscommunications and misjudged manoeuvres, the maritime equivalent of two drivers, both swerving the same direction in a narrow lane, the two vessels collided. The impact itself was not catastrophic, but it was enough. Sparks and friction ignited the volatile cargo aboard the Mont Blanc, and a fire took hold on the doomed ship. Here is the truly heartbreaking part. The burning ship drifted toward the shore, and because a ship on fire in a harbour is a spectacle, people gathered to watch. They came to their windows, they stood on the docks, children pressed their faces to the glass of nearby homes and schools. Nobody understood that the pretty burning ship was moments away from becoming the largest explosion humanity had ever created. The crew of the Mont Blanc, who understood perfectly well, had already fled, unable to warn anyone in time. Then it went off. The blast was almost beyond comprehension. In an instant, a huge swath of the city was simply erased. Buildings flattened, homes obliterated, an entire district reduced to splinters and rubble. The force flung pieces of the ship for enormous distances. Part of the vessel's anchor, weighing over 1,000 pounds, was hurled for miles and buried itself in the ground far across the water. The explosion was so powerful it briefly shoved the water clean out of the harbour, exposing the seabed before the ocean rushed back in as a punishing wave. The human toll was devastating. Roughly 2,000 people were killed and around 9,000 were injured. A catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale for a single city in a single moment. And there was a particularly cruel dimension to it. All those people who had gathered at their windows to watch the fire were standing behind glass when the shockwave hit, shattering the windows into a storm of flying shards. Countless survivors were blinded or lost eyes to the flying glass, and the tragedy would go on to transform the study of eye injuries and care for the blind for years afterward. As if the day hadn't delivered enough horror, a blizzard swept in the very next day, burying the shattered city in snow, hampering desperate rescue efforts, and trapping the injured in the freezing wreckage of their homes. For all of this, the Halifax explosion holds a grim distinction. It was the single largest human-made explosion in the entire history of the world up to that point, and it would keep that terrible title until the arrival of the atomic bomb decades later. A wartime accident in a Canadian harbour, no enemy attack, no deliberate bombing, just two ships and a moment of miscommunication, briefly unleashed a force that wouldn't be matched until humanity built weapons designed specifically to end cities. So the next time you hear a ship's horn drift across a harbour, spare a thought for Halifax, and for the morning an ordinary port town became, for one shattering instant, the loudest place on earth. Here is a sentence that sounds fake, but absolutely is not. Until 1929, Canadian women were not legally considered persons, not people. Persons, a very specific legal word that conveniently kept them out of the Senate and plenty of other important rooms. It took 5 determined women, later celebrated as the famous 5, to drag the question all the way up through the courts until the judges finally, grudgingly, admitted that yes, women were in fact persons. The ruling changed the country forever. But do sit for a moment with the fact that this genuinely had to be argued, on paper, by lawyers well into the 20th century. Let's untangle how a country ends up formally debating whether half its population qualifies as human beings. The trouble came down to a single word buried in Canada's founding constitutional document. That document laid out who could be appointed to the Senate, and it said such appointment should go to qualified persons. Sounds harmless enough. But when women began pushing for the right to sit in the Senate, the men in charge dusted off this old text and made a truly breathtaking argument that when it was written, persons had only ever meant men. Women, they insisted, simply weren't included in the legal meaning of the word, as though the language itself had quietly forgotten they existed. At the centre of the fight was a formidable woman named Emily Murphy, who had become the first female magistrate in the entire British Empire. On her very first day on the bench, a lawyer stood up and objected that she had no business being a judge at all, because being a woman, she wasn't legally a person, and therefore her rulings meant nothing. Imagine showing up to your first day at a job you'd earned, only to be told you don't technically count as a human under the law. Murphy did not take this lying down. she gathered 4 equally determined women, and together they became the famous 5. They petitioned the government to send the question to the country's highest court for a definitive answer. Does the word persons include women? In 1928, the Supreme Court of Canada delivered its verdict, and the verdict was no, unanimously. The nation's top judges officially ruled that women were not persons in the eyes of that clause, on paper, in writing, in the 20th century. But the 5 refused to accept it. Back then, Canada could still appeal its biggest legal questions across the ocean to an even higher court in Britain, the final word of the whole empire. So that's exactly what they did. And there, in 1929, the ruling was overturned. The British judges concluded that of course women were persons, and that excluding them was, in their words, a relic of days more barbarous than ours. One of them compared the Constitution to a living tree, meant to grow and adapt rather than stay frozen in the prejudices of the past. It was a genuine landmark, and in a final twist of irony, Emily Murphy herself never did get the Senate seat she'd helped make possible for others. Today the famous 5 are honoured with statues, celebrated as heroes who pried open a door that should never have been locked. But let the sheer absurdity settle over you as you drift off. Within living memory of some people's grandparents, it was an open legal question, argued solemnly by robed judges on 2 continents, whether a woman was a person at all. Not whether she could vote or work or govern. Whether she was, in the plainest possible sense, a person. It took years, multiple courts, and a voyage across an ocean to reach the answer any child could have supplied in an instant, obviously. When the United States banned alcohol in the 1920s, it created a vast, desperate national thirst, and right next door sat Canada, perfectly happy to help for a reasonable price. Rum runners loaded up boats and trucks, and some even drove straight across frozen rivers, ferrying whiskey south under the cover of night. Fortunes were built almost overnight, a few by families whose names would later grace very respectable liquor labels. It was illegal in America, mostly illegal in Canada, and endlessly profitable for everyone caught in between. For roughly a decade, the world's longest undefended border quietly became the world's busiest happy hour. To set the scene, the United States, in a fit of moral ambition, decided to outlaw the making, selling, and transporting of alcohol nationwide. The problem, as anyone could have predicted, was that banning alcohol did absolutely nothing to reduce the desire for it. Americans still wanted to drink. They just now had to do it illegally. And a country of thirsty people with money is a business opportunity of historic proportions. All that was needed was a reliable supplier. Enter Canada, standing at the fence like a helpful neighbour holding a very large bottle. Here's the beautifully convenient part. While a few Canadian provinces had flirted with their own versions of prohibition, most of that had faded and just Crucially, Canadian distilleries could keep legally producing liquor. Canadian law was mainly concerned with whether the booze was made and sold properly at home. What happened to it after it crossed the border was officially not Canada's problem. So distilleries hummed along, cheerfully manufacturing oceans of whiskey that everyone involved knew perfectly well was destined to be smuggled south. It was the wink and nod economy at its finest. Getting it across was where the real adventure began. Along the coasts, ships loaded with liquor would anchor just outside American waters, forming floating liquor stores where smaller fast boats would zip out, load up, and race back to shore in the dark. Inland, the crossing points became legendary, none more so than the narrow river separating Windsor, Ontario from Detroit. In summer, small boats darted across it constantly. In winter, when the river froze solid, Smugglers simply drove cars and trucks packed with bottles straight across the ice. This worked wonderfully right up until the ice was thinner than hoped, at which point the vehicle, the driver, and a small fortune in whiskey all went straight to the bottom. A risky commute, to say the least. The money involved was staggering, and it attracted everyone from small-time opportunists to serious organised crime. Some of the operations were run by figures who had become notorious, and here's a detail that delights me every time. A number of the fortunes quietly assembled during this era belonged to families whose company names would later become perfectly respectable. World-famous liquor brands sold openly on store shelves. The very same product, the very same families, just with the awkward smuggling chapter politely tucked out of sight. For about a decade, this arrangement made the border between the two countries the liveliest black market on the continent. The Americans had banned the party. The Canadians simply set up the supply line and let the good times and the profits roll north to south. Eventually, the United States admitted defeat, repealed the ban, and made drinking legal again, instantly vaporizing the whole lucrative arrangement. But for that strange, thirsty decade, the polite country to the north had quietly served as America's after-hours liquor cabinet. So the next time someone tells you Canada has always been the mild, rule-following neighbour, gently remind them that it once ran the continent's biggest booze smuggling operation with a completely straight face. For years, one of Canada's most beloved conservationists was a soft-spoken man known as Grey Owl, a figure who claimed indigenous heritage, wore buckskin, kept tame beavers, and toured the world pleading for the protection of the wilderness. Audiences adored him. There was just one enormous problem. He was an Englishman named Archibald Bellamy, born in a sleepy seaside English town, who had essentially invented an entire identity from scratch. The strangest twist of all, his message about protecting nature was completely genuine and years ahead of its time. He was a total fraud attached to a very real cause, and the truth only fully surfaced after he died. Let's start at the beginning, in England, where a young boy named Archie grew up, largely raised by his aunts. From childhood, he was utterly obsessed with the wilderness of North America and with romanticized stories of indigenous life, the kind of fascination many children have, and almost all of them outgrow. Archie did not outgrow it. He nurtured it, fed it, and let it quietly take over his sense of who he wanted to be. As a teenager, he sailed across the ocean to Canada, determined to live the life he'd only read about, and to his credit, he genuinely threw himself into it. He headed into the northern bush, learned to trap and paddle a canoe, spent time among Ojibwe people, and picked up real wilderness skills the hard way. But somewhere along the line, learning about the culture wasn't enough for him. He began to reinvent himself entirely. He grew his hair long, dyed it black, darkened his skin, took to wearing fringed buckskin and feathers, and started telling people he was of indigenous descent, spinning an elaborate backstory about a native mother and a life born to the wild. The shy English boy had vanished, replaced by a striking, weathered figure who called himself Grey Owl. His transformation deepened when he met a young indigenous woman who profoundly changed his outlook. Under her influence, he grew disgusted with trapping and the killing it required, and he turned instead toward protecting animals rather than hunting them. He adopted orphaned beaver kits, raised them like pets in and around his cabin, and became passionately devoted to conservation at a time when almost no one was talking about it. Then came fame. Grey Owl started writing, and his books, vivid, heartfelt, and full of pleas to protect the vanishing wilderness, became enormous bestsellers. He was invited on grand lecture tours, drawing packed crowds across Canada and Britain, where audiences were mesmerized by this seemingly authentic wilderness sage. He even performed before members of the royal family. Everywhere he went, people hung on his words about saving the forests, the rivers, and the beavers he so clearly loved. He was, for a time, one of the most famous conservationists in the world, and it was all built on a lie about who he was. When Grey Owl died, worn out and unwell, the truth came tumbling out almost immediately. Newspapers revealed that the beloved indigenous conservationist was, in fact, an Englishman named Archibald Bellainet, who had fabricated his entire heritage. The revelation stunned his admirers and tangled his legacy into a knot we still argue about today. Because here's the genuinely uncomfortable part. His deception was real, and especially by today's understanding deeply troubling. A man appropriating an identity that was never his. And yet his conservation message was sincere and remarkably prophetic, warning of environmental destruction decades before the world caught up to him. He was a fraud whose fakery served a cause that turned out to be entirely true, which leaves us with a genuinely strange puzzle to fall asleep on. What do you do with a liar who spent his invented life telling the world something it desperately needed to hear? In 1934, in rural Ontario, 5 identical baby girls were born at once. The Dion quintuplets, the first known set to survive infancy. This should have been a quiet, private miracle. Instead, the government took custody of them, built a nursery that doubled as an observation compound, and put the babies on display behind one-way glass for tourists. They called the place Quintland, and millions of visitors came to watch 5 little girls play. Rather like animals in an unusually cheerful zoo, it became one of the biggest tourist attractions of its era, and almost no one at the time seemed to notice how deeply strange and deeply sad the whole thing truly was. Let's begin with just how astonishing their survival was. The 5 girls were born badly premature, so tiny that together they weighed only a fraction of a normal newborn. This was long before the modern medical technology that keeps fragile infants alive today. There were no advanced incubators as we'd know them, no specialized care units. By every reasonable expectation, the baby should not have lived. But against staggering odds, all 5 pulled through, a genuine medical marvel that made headlines around the entire world almost overnight. And that worldwide fame is exactly where their trouble began. This was the middle of the Great Depression, a bleak and money-starved time, and 5 identical surviving babies were an irresistible sensation. Promoters and businessmen immediately began circling, seeing not 5 children but 5 tiny gold mines. When word spread that the girls might be put on public display to make money, the Ontario government stepped in, declaring that the babies needed protection from exploitation. Which sounds noble, until you hear what protection actually looked like. The government removed the girls from their parents and made them wards of the state. Then it built a special facility for them, complete with a nursery and hospital, directly across the road from their family's home. And here's the part that curdles the good intentions. That facility was designed for viewing. It included an observation area with screened windows so that visitors could watch the quintuplets go about their day without the children seeing them back. In the name of shielding the girls from being turned into a spectacle, the authorities had turned them into a spectacle. They named the attraction Quintland, and it became a phenomenon. Tourists arrived by the busload day after day, filing past the viewing galleries to watch the 5 little girls play in their outdoor yard, often multiple times a day on a schedule. Over the years, millions of people made the pilgrimage. It grew into one of the most popular tourist draws in the entire province, rivaling even the great natural wonders nearby. Around it sprang up souvenir stands, gift shops, and a whole economy built on the novelty of 5 children. Their images were used to sell products of every kind. They were, in effect, the most famous babies on Earth, and everyone seemed to profit from them except the girls themselves. Eventually, after years of this, the quintuplets were finally returned to their family. But the reunion was not the happy ending the story seemed to promise, and their later lives carried the heavy weight of those strange early years spent as living exhibits. It's a tale that sounds far too bizarre to be real. A government responding to the fear that 5 children might be exploited by promptly and officially exploiting them itself, complete with an admission gate. And it's a quiet reminder that sometimes the most unsettling chapters of history aren't the loud, violent ones, but the ones where everyone smiled, waved at the babies through the glass, and genuinely believed they were doing something kind. If you ever wish to become an honorary Newfoundlander, be warned, there is a ritual, and it involves a fish. In the tradition known as the Screech-In, a newcomer is asked to recite a phrase in the thick local dialect, take a firm shot of a potent dark rum charmingly named Screech, and then plant a solid kiss directly on the cold, dead lips of a codfish. Yes, on the mouth. Complete all this, and you are warmly welcomed as one of the family. It is bizarre, it is sticky, and it is 100% real. A proud, salty tradition that treats personal dignity as entirely optional. To understand why anyone would willingly kiss a fish, you have to understand Newfoundland, a place with one of the most distinct and joyful cultures anywhere in the country. This is an island shaped by the sea, by centuries of cod fishing, and by long, punishing winters that teach people to find their fun where they can. The result is a community famous for warmth, wicked humour, and an unshakable ability to laugh at absolutely everything, including themselves. The Screech-In is that spirit distilled into a single, delightfully ridiculous ceremony. First, let's talk about the Screech itself, because even the rum has a good story. It's a strong, dark rum, and the legend behind its name involves an unsuspecting visitor, often told as an American serviceman, who knocked back a glass of the stuff for the first time and let out a sound so startled and strangled that it could only be described as a screech. The name stuck, the locals leaned into it, and today Screech is practically a national symbol of the island in a bottle. It is not a sipping rum. It is a bracing, eye-watering, wake-up-your-ancestors kind of rum. Now to the ceremony. When an outsider, a come-from-away, as the locals affectionately call anyone not born there, wants to be inducted, they're gathered up, usually in a lively pub, and put through their paces. The master of ceremonies asks them a question in broad Newfoundland dialect, and the newcomer must reply with the traditional phrase, doing their absolute best to wrap their mouth around words and rhythms they've never attempted before. It rarely goes smoothly, which is entirely the point. Watching a bewildered visitor mangle the local tongue is half the entertainment. Then comes the rum, downed in one go, which tends to produce a fresh round of watering eyes and undignified gasping. And finally the main event, the cod. A real fish is produced, cold, often frozen, and utterly indifferent to the whole affair, and the initiate is instructed to give it a proper kiss right on the lips, not a polite peck, a committed on-the-mouth kiss with a dead fish, while a room full of locals cheers, laughs, and quite possibly records the entire thing for posterity. Survive all of that, and congratulations. You are declared an honorary Newfoundlander, sometimes even handed a little certificate to prove it. You've earned your place through rum, recitation, and a moment of genuine intimacy with a codfish. What makes it wonderful is that everyone involved knows exactly how silly it is, and that's the whole charm. It's not solemn, it's a celebration of hospitality dressed up as a dare. The tradition welcomes strangers by asking them to be a good sport, to laugh at themselves, and to trust that the people putting them through it are doing so out of pure affection. So somewhere tonight, in a warm pub against a cold Atlantic wind, someone is puckering up to a fish, and an entire room is roaring with delight. It is deeply strange. thoroughly real, and honestly one of the more heartwarming ways a place has ever invented to say, "You're one of us now." Off the coast of Nova Scotia sits a small, unremarkable island carrying a very expensive obsession. For more than 2 centuries, treasure hunters have dug into Oak Island, utterly convinced that something priceless lies buried deep below. Pirate gold, lost jewels, sacred relics, take your pick. The pit floods, it collapses, it swallows equipment whole. It has consumed vast fortunes and even a few lives, and after all this time, all that frantic digging, all that stubborn hope, nobody has ever found the treasure. The island's single greatest talent, it seems, is quietly turning confident, wealthy men into broken, bewildered ones. The whole saga supposedly began in the late 1700s, when a young man exploring the little island noticed something odd. A circular depression in the ground beneath an old tree, as though the earth there had once been dug up and refilled. Rumours of pirates burying loot along the coast were common in those days, so he and a couple of friends did what any hopeful teenager would do. They started digging, and what they found only fed the fever. A few feet down they hit a layer of logs, deliberately placed. They cleared it and kept going, and further down, another layer of logs, and then another. This was clearly no natural hole. Someone at some point had gone to enormous effort to bury something deep, sealing the shaft at intervals as they went. It was the perfect recipe for obsession. Obvious signs of human effort, no explanation, and the tantalizing possibility of a reward at the bottom. The legend of the money pit was born, and it has never let go since. But the island had a nasty trick waiting. As diggers over the years pushed deeper, they discovered that the pit seemed to be booby-trapped. Dig down far enough, and the shaft would suddenly flood with seawater, filling faster than anyone could bail it out. Many became convinced that whoever built the pit had engineered hidden tunnels connecting it to the ocean, designed to drown the shaft the moment a would-be thief got close. Whether that's genuine ancient engineering or simply the natural behaviour of a hole dug near the sea has been argued endlessly. Either way, the flooding has defeated expedition after expedition, and the expeditions have been relentless. For over 200 years, wave after wave of treasure hunters has descended on Oak Island, each one certain they'd be the ones to crack it. They've brought shovels, then pumps, then drills, then enormous modern excavation machinery. They've sunk shaft after shaft, poured in staggering amounts of money, and in a few tragic cases lost their lives when the digging went wrong. There's even a grim legend attached, claiming that a certain number of people must die before the treasure will finally give itself up. The theories about what's supposedly down there are gloriously extravagant. Some say it's the buried hoard of a famous pirate. Others insist it's treasure hidden by fleeing nobility, sacred religious relics, or even lost original manuscripts of great literary works. Everyone has a pet theory, and none of them has ever been proven, because in more than 2 centuries of obsessive excavation, no one has ever pulled a definitive treasure out of the ground. That is the truly remarkable thing. This little island has devoured fortunes, careers, machinery, and lives, and in return it has offered up a few intriguing scraps and an endless supply of maybes. It is less a treasure site and more a beautifully efficient machine for converting human confidence into empty bank accounts. So as you drift off, picture that quiet island in the fog, sitting there patiently, keeping its secret, if there even is one, and waiting for the next hopeful soul to arrive with a shovel and a dream. On an autumn evening in 1967, people near Shag Harbour, Nova Scotia, watched something with glowing lights descend from the sky and vanish into the water. This wasn't just a tipsy fisherman's tale. The police saw it. The military got involved. Boats searched the harbour for wreckage, divers went down, and official reports were filed by serious people in serious uniforms. No aircraft was ever reported missing, and no clear explanation was ever produced. To this day, it remains one of the few UFO cases with genuine government paperwork attached, a mystery that Canada politely investigated and then quietly shrugged at. Let's set the scene, because part of what makes this story so compelling is how ordinary the setting was. Shag Harbour was a small, quiet fishing village on the coast of Nova Scotia, the kind of place where the biggest excitement most nights was the weather. There was nothing remarkable about that particular evening until, quite suddenly, there very much was. Multiple people in and around the village looked up and saw a set of bright lights moving through the darkening sky, descending at a steady angle toward the water. Crucially, this wasn't a single witness who could be easily dismissed. Several different people saw it, from different vantage points, locals, young people, drivers passing through. They watched the lights come down and then hit the surface of the water with what several described as a splash or a bright flash, after which the object appeared to float on the waves for a short time before slipping beneath the surface. Some reported a patch of pale, foamy residue left drifting on the water where the thing had gone down. Naturally, people called the authorities, and here's where the story graduates from campfire tale to official record. Members of the police responded, and some of them saw the lights or the floating object with their own eyes. The initial and entirely reasonable assumption was that an aircraft had crashed into the harbour, which would mean a rescue operation was urgently needed. So the machinery of a serious emergency response kicked into gear. Boats went out to the site. The Coast Guard became involved. And in the days that followed, military divers were brought in to search the seabed for wreckage, bodies, anything that might explain what had plunged into the water in front of so many witnesses. It was a genuine official search, not a bunch of enthusiasts poking around, but uniformed personnel conducting a methodical investigation on the assumption that something real had come down. And they found nothing. No crashed plane, no debris field, no wreckage of any kind. Then came the part that turned a strange night into an enduring mystery. When the authorities checked, no aircraft, civilian or military, had been reported missing or unaccounted for. Whatever those people had watched descend from the sky and sink into the harbour, it did not match any known plane, and it left behind no physical trace anyone could recover. With no explanation and no wreckage, the case was eventually filed away, quietly logged in official records under the unglamorous heading of an unidentified flying object. And there it has sat ever since, one of the very few UFO incidents anywhere in the world that comes attached to real government documentation, credible multiple witnesses, and an official search that came up empty-handed. No little green men ever appeared, no dramatic conspiracy was ever confirmed, and no tidy answer was ever offered. Canada looked into it, searched the water thoroughly, found precisely nothing, and then, in the most Canadian way imaginable, more or less shrugged, closed the file, and got on with things. The lights over Shag Harbour remain unexplained to this day, glowing quietly at the edge of the country's history like a question no one ever managed to answer. In the early 1920s, a team of researchers in Toronto achieved something almost unbelievable. They discovered insulin transforming diabetes from a certain death sentence into a manageable condition, and then they did something even more unbelievable. Rather than get spectacularly rich, they sold the patent to their own university for $1, $1, because they firmly believed a life-saving medicine should belong to the whole world, not to their bank accounts. It stands as one of the most genuinely noble acts in the history of medicine. It also sounds completely made up in a world where a small bottle of that very drug can now cost a small fortune. To grasp the magnitude of what these researchers did, You have to understand how utterly hopeless diabetes was before them. For a person with the most serious form of the disease, a diagnosis was essentially a slow death sentence. Doctors had no real treatment. The only thing they could offer was to put patients on brutal near-starvation diets that might buy a little more time while the person wasted away. Hospital wards held children slipping quietly toward the end, and there was nothing anyone could do but watch. It was one of medicine's cruelest dead ends. Then, in a laboratory in Toronto, a small team set out to change that. Working through a punishing stretch of experiments, long nights, countless trials, and a great deal of frustration, they managed to isolate and purify the substance the body uses to regulate blood sugar, the very thing these patients were missing. They had, in effect, found the missing piece. But an experimental extract in a lab is one thing. Proving it could save a human life was another. The moment of truth came with a dying teenage boy, wasted to almost nothing by the disease and clearly near the end. The researchers gave him their new treatment, and it worked. The boy, who'd been fading away, began to recover. It was the kind of result that turns quiet lab work into medical history, a genuine resurrection, achieved with a needle and a substance that had not existed as a medicine mere months before. Word spread fast, and suddenly the impossible was real. Diabetes, the great killer, could be managed. Now, here is the moment where nearly anyone would have cashed in. The team held the rights to one of the most valuable medical discoveries imaginable, a treatment that millions of desperate people around the world would need, over and over, for the rest of their lives. The commercial value was almost incalculable. They could have become some of the wealthiest people on the planet. Instead, they chose the opposite path. They took out a patent not to lock the discovery away, but specifically to protect it, ensuring no one else could seize control of it or produce dangerous, unreliable versions. And then they handed that patent over to their university for the symbolic price of $1. Their reasoning was as simple as it was extraordinary. A discovery that could save so many lives shouldn't be a source of personal profit. It belonged, they felt, to everyone who needed it. One of them reportedly bristled at the very idea that a doctor might grow rich off a cure people depended on to survive. It's a story so decent it almost strains belief, a life-saving miracle deliberately given away for $1 out of sheer principle, and it lands with a particularly sharp irony today, in a world where that same essential medicine can carry a price tag steep enough to frighten the very patients it keeps alive. The people who discovered it wanted it to belong to the world. As you drift off tonight, it's worth quietly wondering what they'd make of how the world has priced it since. This Stanley Cup is the most sacred object in hockey, a gleaming silver trophy handled like a holy relic. Historically, though, it has been treated less like a treasure and more like a very heavy, very unwelcome party guest. Over the years, it has been used as a flower pot, left forgotten on the side of a road, and in one glorious tale, drop-kicked into a frozen canal by celebrating players who then calmly fished it out the next day. It has been lost, dented, and reportedly used to feed a dog. For an object this revered, the cup has led a shockingly undignified life. Let's start with what the cup is supposed to be, because the contrast is the whole joke. It was donated well over a century ago by a British aristocrat serving as the country's Governor-General, intended as a grand prize for the best hockey team. It has since become the single most coveted trophy in the sport, an object players dream about their entire lives and weep openly upon finally hoisting. There is a beautiful tradition attached to it too. Rather than lock it away in a display case, the winning team gets to spend real time with it, and individual players are each granted their own day to take the cup wherever they please and do whatever they like with it. And therein lies the problem. When you hand the most sacred object in your sport to a rotating cast of ecstatic, celebrating athletes and tell them to take it home and have fun, you are going to get stories. glorious, undignified, hard-to-believe stories. The most legendary of them concerns a group of players from an early championship team who, flush with victory and quite possibly with drink, were making their way home past a frozen canal. On a dare, or perhaps just in a burst of triumphant nonsense, someone drop-kicked the cup, the holiest object in hockey, out onto the ice of the canal, where it skidded to a stop. In some tellings it was left there overnight before the sheepish, sobered-up players trudged back the next day to retrieve it, no doubt relieved to find it hadn't sunk out of sight. That's only the beginning. Over the decades the cup has racked up a rap sheet of indignities that would make a museum curator faint. It has, by various accounts, been left behind on the side of a road and forgotten. It has been abandoned at a photographer's studio for an embarrassing stretch of time. In one famous story, it ended up in a family's home where it was casually used as a flower pot, filled with soil and blooms as though it were a decorative planter rather than the pinnacle of athletic achievement, and the personal day tradition has only added to the legend. The cup has been used to hold and serve food and drink, has had babies playfully baptized in its bowl, has been taken to wild parties, and has reportedly even been used as a dish for a pet to eat from. It has been dented, scratched, dropped, and dragged through more chaotic celebrations than anyone can count. This is an object treated with genuine reverence one moment and used as a popcorn bowl the next. The wonderful thing is that all of it is part of the cup's charm. It's a trophy with a life story, a battered, well-travelled, deeply human history of joy taken slightly too far. Most great prizes sit pristine behind glass, untouched and a little lifeless. Not this one. So the next time you see players lift that gleaming silver trophy with tears in their eyes, remember it has almost certainly at some point been a flower pot, a punting ball, and a dog's dinner dish. And somehow, that only makes it more beloved. During the Klondike Gold Rush, thousands of hopeful dreamers stampeded north expecting to strike it rich. The trouble was, the region was so remote and so deadly that people were quite literally starving to death. So the Mounties, in a burst of grim practicality, made a rule. You could not enter unless you brought roughly a ton of supplies, about a full year's worth of food and gear, hauled up a brutal mountain pass on your own back, one crushing load at a time. Many made that climb dozens of times. Most never found any gold, but every single one of them found out exactly how heavy a ton of bacon really feels. It all kicked off when word reached the outside world that gold had been discovered in a remote corner of the far northwest. The news hit like a lightning bolt, and it triggered one of the great manias of the age. Something like 100,000 people dropped their entire lives, jobs, homes, families, and set off for the goldfields, convinced that riches were simply lying in the creeks waiting to be scooped up. Very few of them had any real idea what they were walking into, because the goldfields were guarded not by fences but by geography, and the geography was merciless. To reach the diggings, a would-be prospector generally had to sail north as far as the boats went, then cross a wall of brutal coastal mountains on foot, and only then continue on by boat down a long river system to the boomtown at the heart of the rush. It was a punishing journey through some of the harshest terrain and weather on the continent, and the most infamous obstacle of all was a steep mountain pass that stood between the newcomers and the interior. Now here's the problem the authorities faced. This region was so isolated and so unforgiving that food and supplies couldn't reliably reach it. Stampeders were arriving in enormous numbers with wildly inadequate provisions, and the very real result was starvation. People were going to die by the thousands, not from mining accidents, but from simply running out of food in a frozen wilderness with nowhere to buy more. So the mounted police stationed at the summit that marked the border laid down a rule that was as harsh as it was sensible. No one would be allowed to cross into the interior unless they were carrying roughly a year's worth of supplies: food, tools, clothing, the works. All told, it added up to something in the neighbourhood of a ton of goods per person. If you showed up with less, you were simply turned back. No exceptions, no matter how badly you wanted that gold. And this is where the real ordeal began, because nobody could carry a ton on their back in one trip. Instead, prospectors had to haul their mountain of gear up that treacherous pass piece by piece, loading up 60 or so pounds at a time, climbing the brutal slope, dropping the load at the top, and trudging all the way back down to do it again, and again, and again. It could take dozens upon dozens of trips, spread over weeks, to move a single person's supplies over that one pass. The most notorious stretch was a steep climb, where the endless line of laden climbers, hunched under their loads, plodded up carved steps in the snow in a slow, grinding chain that seemed never to end. Picture it, freezing, exhausted, aching, climbing the same murderous slope for the 40th time. Also, you'd be allowed to go maybe get rich. And the gut punch at the end of it? By the time most of these people finally reached the goldfields, the best claims had long since been snapped up. The vast majority never struck it rich at all. They endured one of the most physically brutal journeys imaginable, hauling a ton of bacon and beans up a mountain, only to arrive too late. If you ever needed proof that the dream of easy fortune is almost always neither easy nor a fortune, the Klondike carried it up the pass, one crushing load at a time. Canada's iconic red-coated Mounties did not exactly ride in gently. They were created in a hurry after a grim event known as the Cypress Hills Massacre, in which a group of American wolf hunters slaughtered a camp of indigenous people over a dispute about stolen horses. Alarmed that the lawless frontier was spiralling out of control, the government hastily assembled a police force and sent them on an epic, disorganised, nearly disastrous march west. Short on food, short on water, and short on functioning horses. Somehow they survived it, planted their flag and became a national symbol. The friendly Mountie on the postcard was born out of chaos and blood. To understand why the Mounties were needed, you have to understand just how wild the Canadian West was at the time. The vast prairies stretched out with almost no formal law of any kind, and into that emptiness had drifted a rough crowd of American traders, wolf hunters, and whiskey peddlers who ran illegal trading posts and did more or less whatever they pleased. It was a lawless frontier in the fullest sense, and the people who suffered most were the indigenous nations of the plains, exposed to exploitation, violence, and a flood of cheap, ruinous alcohol traded across the border. The breaking point was the Cypress Hills Massacre. A group of these hunters, convinced, probably wrongly, that a nearby Assiniboine camp had made off with some of their horses, worked themselves into a rage and attacked. What followed was a slaughter of indigenous men, women, and children, a brutal act of frontier justice that was really just murder. When news of it reached the government back east, it landed like a slap. If armed foreigners could ride into Canadian territory and massacre people with no consequences, then Canada didn't really control its own west at all. It just had a claim on a map. So the government moved quickly to create a mounted police force, dress them in distinctive red coats, and send them out to impose order, shut down the whiskey trade, and make it clear that this land had laws now. It was a sound idea. The execution was another matter entirely. The force set off on what became known as the Great March West, an enormous journey across roughly 1,000 miles of open prairie to reach the troubled region. And it was, by nearly every measure, a slow-motion disaster. The column was underprepared and overambitious. The horses, unused to the harsh conditions, began to weaken and die. Food ran low, water was scarce, and what they found was often foul. Men and animals alike suffered terribly under the sun, the distance, and the sheer punishing monotony of the plains. At times, the whole grand expedition looked less like a triumphant show of authority and more like a straggling parade of exhausted men wondering what on earth they'd signed up for. And yet, somehow, they made it. Battered, thinned out, and thoroughly humbled, the survivors reached their destination, established their posts, and began the work of bringing order to the frontier. Out of that miserable, chaotic trek grew one of the most recognizable institutions on Earth. The gallant, upright, ever-polite Mountie of legend, the one on the postcards, the one who always gets his man, traces directly back to a hasty response to a massacre and a march so badly planned it nearly killed the very men sent to fix things. Behind the shiny scarlet symbol was a beginning that was anything but tidy. Here is a lovely one to drift off to. Canada may well be named after a simple mix-up. When early French explorers arrived, local indigenous people used the word Kanata, meaning a village or settlement, to point them toward a nearby community. The explorers, missing the nuance entirely, apparently decided that Kanata must be the name of the whole enormous region, and it stuck. So one of the largest countries on Earth possibly owes its entire name to two groups of people, thoroughly misunderstanding one another over what were essentially directions. Honestly, extremely on brand for Canada. Let's rewind to the moment of the great linguistic fumble. A French explorer had sailed up the mighty river that carves through the eastern part of the continent, poking along the shoreline and trying to make sense of this vast new land. Like every explorer of the era, he was keenly interested in two things: where the valuable stuff was and what everything was called. To answer the second question, he relied on the local indigenous people, in this case, speakers of an Iroquoian language, to name the places around him. At some point, gesturing toward a settlement up the river, his indigenous guides used their word for it, Kanata. In their language, this simply meant a village or a group of dwellings, a perfectly ordinary practical word. They were essentially saying that over there is a village. They were pointing at a specific cluster of homes, giving directions the way anyone might say the town is just up the road. The explorer, however, heard something grander. Whether through a genuine misunderstanding or just wishful interpretation, he took Kanata to be the proper name of the land itself. And so this humble little word for village got promoted in the mind of a confused visitor to the title of an entire territory. From there it spread outward on maps and in documents, the region growing larger and larger over the years, until eventually it stretched to encompass one of the most enormous countries on the planet. Now, it's worth being fair to history here. The exact details are murky, as they always are with events this old, and language and naming are messy things. But the widely accepted origin really does trace the name back to that indigenous word for a settlement, elevated far beyond its original meaning by newcomers who didn't fully grasp what they were being told. A word meant to indicate one small village came to name a nation spanning half a continent. And there's something almost perfect about that. It's a founding story with no grand conqueror stamping his name on the land, no king demanding the territory be called after himself, no dramatic act of possession. Instead, the country's very name may spring from a polite exchange of directions gone slightly sideways, a moment of two peoples not quite understanding each other, ending in a label that simply stuck around because no one bothered to correct it. For a nation that would go on to build a reputation for mildness, modesty, and a certain endearing awkwardness, it's hard to imagine a more fitting origin. Most countries carry names rooted in empires, gods, or ancient tribes. Canada may quite literally be named Village, because someone pointed at a town and someone else wrote down the wrong thing. As you drift off tonight, take comfort in that. An entire country, possibly named by accident, and none the worse for it. On a warm summer afternoon in 1912, the young prairie city of Regina was going peacefully about its ordinary business when the sky slowly turned an unnatural shade of green. Then a tornado, enormous, roaring, and utterly merciless, dropped down and carved a path of destruction straight through the heart of the city. Buildings were shredded, homes flung apart, and lives lost in a matter of minutes. It remains the deadliest tornado in all of Canadian history. For a country far better known for blizzards and bone-deep cold, it was a violent, screaming reminder that the flat, quiet prairie can turn monstrous with almost no warning at all. Picture the setting first. Regina was a bustling, ambitious young city out on the wide-open plains, the kind of place that was growing fast and full of confidence. That particular day was a holiday, warm and pleasant, the sort of afternoon when people are out and about, relaxing, boating on the little lake, enjoying the weather without a care in the world. There was no reason to suspect that within the hour a good chunk of the city would be reduced to matchwood. The trouble with the prairie is that there's nothing to hide behind and nothing to slow a storm down. The land is famously, endlessly flat, which is charming on a calm day and genuinely terrifying when the weather turns hostile. On this afternoon, the atmosphere brewed up something dreadful, and the telltale signs began to appear. The air growing heavy and still, the light shifting to that eerie, sickly green that anyone who has lived through severe weather learns to dread. Then came the funnel, dropping down out of the churning sky and touching the earth. What followed was swift and catastrophic. The tornado tore directly through populated parts of the city, including areas packed with homes and buildings. It didn't politely skirt the edges, it ploughed through the heart of things. In mere minutes, because tornadoes do their worst with horrifying speed, it flattened houses, demolished larger structures, tossed debris through the air like confetti, and left a scar of ruin across the community. People had almost no time to react. One moment it was a lovely holiday afternoon. The next, the world was being ripped apart around them. The human cost was severe, and the storm claimed the lives of a number of residents, earning it the grim distinction of being the deadliest tornado the country has ever recorded. Many more were injured, and countless families were left homeless in an instant, their houses simply gone. In the aftermath, the young city faced an enormous task, digging out from the wreckage, caring for the injured, and somehow rebuilding what the wind had erased in a matter of minutes, and rebuild it did. Regina recovered, dusted itself off, and carried on, as prairie towns tend to do. But the memory of that afternoon lodged itself permanently in the country's history as a reminder of something people don't usually associate with Canada at all. Because when most of the world pictures Canadian weather, they think of snow, endless winters, frozen lakes, the gentle national relationship with the cold. They rarely think of violent, roaring tornadoes ripping across sun-baked plains. Yet the prairie holds that hidden temper. It can be flat, golden, and serene one moment, and a screaming green nightmare the next. As you settle in tonight, safe and still, spare a thought for that quiet holiday afternoon that turned, without warning, into the most destructive few minutes the prairie sky has ever unleashed. In the 1970s, the province of New Brunswick decided to build the future. A sleek, gull-winged sports car with doors that swung dramatically upward, called the Bricklin. It was meant to be safe, stylish, and a glowing source of local pride. Instead, the doors sometimes stubbornly refused to open. The body panels warped, the costs ballooned, and each car reportedly sold for far less than it actually cost to build. The whole gleaming dream collapsed in spectacular and enormously expensive fashion, dragging a mountain of public money down with it. Today the Bricklin survives as a collector's curiosity, a beautiful monument to optimism sprinting well ahead of engineering. The dream started with big ambitions and a charismatic pitch. An entrepreneur came along with a vision for a bold new sports car, one that would be both dazzling to look at and genuinely safe to drive, a rare combination at the time. The car would feature dramatic doors that lifted upward like wings, a striking coloured body, and a whole host of safety-minded features. All it needed was somewhere to build it, and some serious money to get started. New Brunswick, eager to bring jobs and glamour and a shining modern industry to the province, enthusiastically signed on, pouring substantial public funds into the venture and betting big on the future of Canadian car making. On paper, it was thrilling. A homegrown sports car built by local workers, rolling off the line and out into the world with a distinctly futuristic flair. For a moment it must have felt like the province was about to put itself on the map as a hub of automotive cool. And to be fair, the car really did look the part. Low, sleek and eye-catching, with those unmistakable upward swinging doors that made it look like something from a film about tomorrow. The trouble was that looking futuristic and actually working reliably turned out to be two very different things. The signature doors, so gorgeous in concept, were heavy and temperamental in practice, and they had an unfortunate habit of sticking, sometimes trapping drivers who could only sit there and contemplate their life choices, while the wing that was supposed to whoosh open elegantly simply refused to budge. The body material warped and gave the assembly line fits. Quality problems piled up, and every one of these headaches cost money to sort out. Which brings us to the fatal flaw. The numbers never came close to working. Building each car was expensive, more expensive in fact than the price the cars were actually sold for. That is a wonderful way to run a charity and a catastrophic way to run a business. Every single vehicle that rolled out the door represented a loss, which meant the more successful the factory was at building cars, the faster it hemorrhaged cash. It was like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain wide open. Predictably, the whole enterprise came crashing down. The costs spiraled out of control, the money ran dry, and the company collapsed into bankruptcy, taking a very large pile of public funds down with it. Only a few thousand of the cars were ever made before the dream sputtered to a halt, leaving behind unpaid bills, disappointed workers, and a province wondering how its glamorous leap into the future had gone so badly wrong. And yet, here's the twist that softens the story. Because so few were built, and because the design really was so striking, the surviving bricklins became genuinely collectible over time, sought-after oddities cherished by enthusiasts who adore their gorgeous doomed ambition. So the car that bankrupted a province eventually found a kind of redemption as a beloved curiosity. It never conquered the future, but it did become an unforgettable, wing-doored reminder that sometimes the boldest dreams are the ones that fall apart most beautifully. During the Second World War, Canada tied itself in painful knots over the question of conscription. The awkward compromise produced a strange class of soldier, men drafted only for home defence, who could not be forced to fight overseas. Their frustrated comrades handed them a mocking nickname, zombies, the living dead of the Canadian Army, in uniform but never sent to the front. It stirred up bitterness, a full-blown political crisis, and no small amount of shame on all sides. It is a genuinely bizarre chapter, a country so divided over how to fight a war that it effectively invented an army of reluctant homebound ghosts. To understand how this happened, you have to appreciate what a genuinely explosive issue conscription was in Canada. The country was, and is, deeply divided in ways that made forcing men to fight overseas politically radioactive. Large parts of the population strongly opposed compulsory service in a distant war, while others felt just as strongly that everyone should be obligated to serve. A leader trying to hold the whole country together during a world war had to walk this tightrope very, very carefully, because coming down hard on either side risked tearing the nation apart at home while it was trying to fight abroad. So the government reached for a classic compromise, the kind that tries to please everyone and ends up creating something distinctly odd. It passed a measure allowing men to be conscripted, but only for the defence of Canada itself. These draftees could be required to put on the uniform, train, and serve within the country's own borders and territory, but they could not be compelled to ship out and fight overseas. That final, decisive step had to be voluntary. If a home defence conscript wanted to go fight the actual war in Europe or elsewhere, he had to willingly agree to it. This produced a peculiar situation. You now had a whole category of soldiers in uniform, on the payroll, trained up and ready, who were nonetheless staying firmly at home while their volunteer counterparts were shipping off to face the real dangers of the front. And soldiers, being soldiers, were not shy about their opinions on the matter. The men who had volunteered to fight, or who wanted the home defence men to step up and join them, viewed these stay-at-home conscripts with open scorn. And so came the nickname. The volunteers began mockingly calling them zombies, the walking dead. In uniform but lifeless in the ways that counted, present but not truly in the fight, shuffling around at home while the war raged overseas without them. It was a cutting, contemptuous label, and it stuck hard. The word captured all the frustration and resentment of the moment in a single sneering syllable. The whole arrangement eventually boiled over into a serious political crisis as the war dragged on, and the need for more overseas fighters grew desperate. Pressure mounted to finally send the home defence men into the real conflict, and when that pressure won out, it caused enormous bitterness and upheaval on all sides. Anger from those who felt betrayed by being sent after all, and anger from those who felt the men should have gone long ago. It's a chapter that sounds almost too strange to be true. A nation so torn over how to wage war that it created a distinct class of soldier who could be drafted but not deployed, and then watch their comrades brand them the living dead. As you drift off, picture it. An entire army of reluctant homefront ghosts in uniform, going nowhere, carrying a nickname that followed them long after the guns fell silent. Far out in the Atlantic, off the coast of Nova Scotia, lies a thin crescent of sand called Sable Island, a lonely sliver of dune and grass surrounded by fog, shipwrecks, and endless grey water. And running across it, almost impossibly, are hundreds of wild horses. No one is entirely certain how the very first ones arrived centuries ago, but they have been surviving on that windswept ribbon ever since, drinking from freshwater ponds and weathering brutal storms with no shelter and no help at all. They are fiercely protected today. It is a fairy tale made real. Untouched horses galloping across a sandbar in the middle of the open ocean. Let's start with the island itself because it is a genuinely strange place. Sable Island is little more than a long, narrow curve of sand rising just barely out of the North Atlantic, far from the mainland, wrapped almost perpetually in fog. It has no trees to speak of, no shelter, and no rugged rocky bones, just shifting dunes, tough grasses, and the constant push of wind and waves. It sits in waters so treacherous, with such hidden sandbars and sudden storms, that it earned a fearsome reputation as a graveyard of ships, claiming countless vessels over the centuries. It is, in short, about the last place you'd expect to find herds of healthy horses thriving, and yet there they are. Somewhere in the murk of history, horses were brought to this remote sandbar. The exact circumstances a bit hazy, wrapped in old stories of ships and settlers and animals left behind. However they got there, they didn't just survive. They took root, left to their own devices with no humans managing them and no predators hunting them. The horses went wild and have remained wild ever since, generation after generation, for a very long time. life on the island is not gentle. These are not pampered stable horses munching oats in a cosy paddock. They endure howling Atlantic storms with nothing to hide behind, dig through their harsh environment for the tough grasses that sustain them, and drink from small pools of fresh water that collect among the dunes. Winters are bleak and battering. The wind never really stops, and still the herds persist, shaggy and hardy and utterly self-sufficient, perfectly adapted to a place that seems almost designed to be uninhabitable. For a while in their history, there were people who wanted to interfere, to round the horses up, remove them, or put them to human use, treating them as a resource rather than a wonder. But over time, sentiment shifted decisively in the horses' favour. It came to be understood that these animals were something special and irreplaceable, and strong protections were put in place. Today the horses of Sable Island are left entirely alone, allowed to live out their wild lives without human meddling, watched over from a respectful distance, and cherished as a national treasure. There is something deeply moving about the image, especially as you settle in for sleep. Picture it. A thin ribbon of sand adrift in a vast grey ocean, fog rolling over the dunes, waves crashing on all sides, and there, manes streaming in the wind, a herd of wild horses moving freely across the sand, owing nothing to anyone. They weren't supposed to be there. The place should have been too harsh, too isolated, too unforgiving. But they endured anyway, quietly, stubbornly, for centuries, turning an inhospitable sandbar in the middle of nowhere into one of the most improbable and beautiful pockets of wildness on Earth. Long before a certain Scottish loch got all the attention, Canada had its very own resident lake monster. In the deep, cold waters of Okanagan Lake in British Columbia, people have reported sightings for well over a century of a long, serpentine creature gliding beneath the surface. They named it Ogopogo, which sounds rather less like a terrifying beast and more like a discontinued breakfast cereal. Indigenous stories told of a powerful lake spirit long before the tourists and cameras ever arrived. Whether it is a floating log, a rolling wave, a large fish, or something genuinely unexplained, Ogopogo has been politely refusing to be photographed clearly for generations. Let's start with the lake, because it's the perfect stage for a legend. Okanagan Lake is long, deep and dark, stretching through a beautiful valley in the interior of British Columbia. It's the kind of body of water where the surface can look glassy and serene one moment, then ripple and churn the next, where sunlight glints off waves in ways that play tricks on the eye, and where the sheer depth leaves plenty of room for the imagination to wander. If you were going to place a mysterious creature anywhere, a deep, moody lake like this one is exactly where you'd put it. And the idea of something living in those waters is far older than any tourist snapshot. Long before European settlers arrived, the indigenous people of the region had stories of a powerful being associated with the lake, a water spirit, respected and feared, not to be trifled with. This wasn't a cute cryptid for selling postcards. It was a serious part of the spiritual landscape, a presence that commanded caution and respect from those who lived alongside the water. The notion that the lake held something more than fish was woven into the culture of the area from the very beginning. Then came the settlers, the newspapers, and eventually the tourists, and the old idea took on a new, snappier form. Sightings began to be reported and written up. Witnesses describing a long, dark, serpent-like shape moving through the water, humps breaking the surface, something large and unexplained cutting across the lake before vanishing. Over the years, the reports piled up one after another from all sorts of people, and the creature earned its catchy, oddly cheerful name. A name that, let's be honest, does little to inspire genuine terror. It's hard to lie awake in fear of something called a Gapogo. It sounds like it should come with a toy in the box. Of course, no one has ever produced the clinching proof. There are blurry photos, shaky bits of footage, and endless eyewitness accounts, but nothing that definitively settles the question. Skeptics have plenty of perfectly reasonable explanations on offer. A floating log bobbing in just the right way, a line of waves from a passing boat, an otter or a large sturgeon, or simply the mind's eager habit of turning ambiguous shapes into something meaningful. Any of these could account for a great many sightings, and probably do. But the legend endures anyway, and that's really the charm of it. Ogopogo has become a beloved local icon, a source of tourism, folklore, and gentle fun, a monster friendly enough to put on a sign, and mysterious enough to keep people watching the water just a little longer than they otherwise might. Whether there's anything truly down there or not almost doesn't matter. As you drift off tonight, picture that long, dark lake under a fading sky, its surface rippling in the breeze, and somewhere out in the deep water, a legend that has spent well over a century declining, ever so politely to be caught on camera. In the spring of 1919, the city of Winnipeg simply switched itself off. Tens of thousands of workers walked off the job all at once in what became one of the largest general strikes in history. Factories fell silent, streetcars stopped mid-route, deliveries halted, the entire machinery of a major city grinding to a complete standstill. Tensions climbed for weeks until a confrontation finally turned violent on a day remembered ever after as Bloody Saturday. The strike itself was crushed, but it left a permanent mark on the country's politics and its labour movement. For a few electric weeks, ordinary Winnipeggers held an entire city in their hands. To understand how a whole city can grind to a halt, you have to picture the mood of the time. It was just after the end of the First World War, a period of enormous upheaval. Soldiers were returning home expecting a better life, and often finding hardship instead. Prices were high, wages were low, jobs were uncertain, and working conditions in many industries were harsh. All across the country, ordinary working people were frustrated and exhausted, feeling that they were doing the hard labour while seeing little of the reward. Winnipeg, a major hub, became the place where all that pressure finally burst. It began with specific disputes over wages and the right of workers to bargain collectively. But it grew into something far bigger than any single grievance. In a remarkable show of solidarity, workers from across countless trades and industries decided to walk off the job together all at once, in sympathy with one another. The scale of it was staggering. This wasn't one factory or one union. It was a huge cross-section of the city's entire workforce laying down their tools in unison. And the effect was surreal. A bustling modern city runs on the constant labour of thousands of people, most of it invisible until it stops. When the workers walked out, that invisible machinery seized up all at once. The streetcars that normally rattled through the streets fell still. Deliveries ceased. Services that everyone relied on without thinking suddenly weren't there. The city didn't burn or riot in the early days. It simply went quiet, brought to a standstill not by an army or a disaster, but by the collective decision of ordinary people to stop working. It was a stunning demonstration of just how much power rests in the hands of the people who actually keep everything running. Naturally, this terrified those in positions of authority and business, who saw the strike as a dangerous threat to order and reacted with alarm and hostility. As the weeks dragged on, the standoff hardened, and the atmosphere grew tense and fearful on all sides. The situation was a powder keg. It finally exploded on the day that came to be known as Bloody Saturday. A confrontation in the streets turned violent. authorities moved forcefully against the crowds, and the clash left casualties in its wake. A grim, bruising end to what had begun as a peaceful show of unity. In the aftermath, the strike was broken, its leaders targeted, and the workers eventually returned to their jobs without having won their immediate demands. But it was far from meaningless. The events in Winnipeg burned themselves into the country's memory, shaping its labour movement and its politics for decades to come, inspiring future generations of workers and reformers. As you settle in tonight, think of that strange, silent city, hushed by the will of its own people, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing a community can do is, together, simply stop. In the 1950s, Canada built something astonishing. The Avro Arrow, a sleek supersonic interceptor jet so advanced that it genuinely stunned the aviation world. It was fast, it was beautiful, and it was years ahead of its time, a real point of national pride. And then, on a single day in 1959, the government cancelled the entire program. Not merely cancelled it, but ordered the finished aircraft, the blueprints and the models, all of it, cut apart and destroyed. Thousands of workers lost their jobs, brilliant engineers scattered abroad, and a national dream was fed straight into the scrapyard. Canadians still argue bitterly about it to this very day. Let's appreciate just how impressive the Arrow was, because that's what makes its fate sting so much. In an era when the world's great powers were pouring resources into cutting-edge aviation, Canada, not a superpower, not an aerospace giant, designed and built a jet that could stand shoulder to shoulder with anything else in the sky. It was a striking needle-nosed, delta-winged interceptor, built to scream through the upper atmosphere at incredible speeds, intended to defend the vast northern skies against potential threats. When it was unveiled, it was a genuine triumph, a symbol of what a relatively small country could achieve when it dared to aim high. The engineers and workers who built it were among the best anywhere, and the aircraft they produced was world-class. For a moment, the future looked dazzling. Here was homegrown proof that Canada could compete at the very frontier of technology, employing thousands of skilled people, and building something the whole world took notice of. National pride swelled. This wasn't just a plane, it was a statement about what the country could be. And then it all came crashing down with brutal suddenness. The program was enormously expensive. The strategic landscape was shifting, and the government of the day made the fateful decision to pull the plug entirely. That in itself might have been a defensible, if painful, budgetary choice. But what happened next is the part that has haunted the national memory ever since. The order didn't just stop future work. It called for the near-total destruction of everything that had been built. The completed aircraft, gleaming, advanced, some of them capable of flight, were cut into pieces. The tooling was destroyed. Plans and models were scrapped. In a matter of time, one of the proudest technological achievements the country had ever produced was systematically dismantled and erased, as though the goal were to leave no trace it had ever existed. Watching a triumph be deliberately demolished is a uniquely gutting thing, and for the people who had poured their skill and passion into the Arrow, it was devastating. The human toll was immediate and enormous. Thousands of highly skilled workers were thrown out of work in an instant. And here's a detail that adds a special sting. Many of the brilliant engineers and designers, suddenly unemployed and unwanted at home, were quickly snapped up by aerospace programs in other countries, where they went on to contribute to some of the most famous achievements in flight and space exploration elsewhere. Canada had trained a generation of aviation genius and then handed it away. To this day, the fate of the Avro Arrow remains one of the great sore spots of Canadian history, a source of endless debate, wistful what-ifs, and lingering resentment. Was it a sensible if brutal decision, or a catastrophic act of self-sabotage? People still argue passionately on both sides, but nearly everyone agrees on the tragedy of the destruction itself. As you drift off, picture that beautiful doomed jet, a nation's soaring ambition, built with pride and then cut to pieces, flying now only in the imagination of a country that never quite got over losing it. And finally tonight, a small act of pure frustration that quietly reorganized the entire planet. A Canadian engineer named Sanford Fleming once missed a train, reportedly because the printed schedule used a confusing local time, and rather than simply grumbling like the rest of us mortals, he decided the whole world's clocks were the actual problem. He proposed carving the globe into standard time zones so that time itself would finally make sense across long distances. His idea caught on internationally, and it is essentially the very system we still rely on today. So the next time you check the hour in another country, quietly thank a mildly annoyed Canadian who simply refused to let one late train slide. To grasp why this was such a big deal, you have to understand how gloriously chaotic timekeeping used to be. For most of history, time was a strictly local affair. Each town and city simply set its clocks by the sun. Noon was whenever the sun was highest overhead in that particular spot. This worked perfectly well when the fastest anyone travelled was on horseback, and nobody much cared whether the next village over was a few minutes ahead or behind. Every community was its own little island of time, and it caused no real trouble. But then came the railways, and the whole cosy arrangement fell apart. Suddenly people and goods were zipping across vast distances at unprecedented speeds, passing through dozens of towns that each kept their own slightly different time. Trying to build a coherent train schedule across all these mismatched local clocks was a nightmare. A timetable might list departures and arrivals in a tangle of different local times, and travellers were left endlessly confused about when, exactly, anything was actually happening. It was a recipe for missed connections, chaos, and a great deal of standing on platforms watching trains pull away. Which brings us to Fleming's famous moment of exasperation. As the story goes, he found himself stranded, having missed a train, thanks to precisely this kind of confusion, a schedule whose muddled time notation left him waiting when he should have been travelling. Most of us in that situation would fume, complain to whoever was nearby and eventually get over it. Fleming, being an engineer with an unusually ambitious mind, did something rather different. He looked at his own irritation and concluded that the real culprit wasn't the train or the station or even himself. It was the entire disorganized global approach to time. So he set about fixing it, not for his town, not for his country, but for the whole world. He championed the idea of dividing the globe into a series of standard time zones, broad bands within which everyone would agree to keep the same time, with orderly, sensible jumps from one zone to the next as you travelled. Instead of thousands of local times all slightly out of step, the planet would run on a tidy shared system that made long-distance travel and communication actually workable. He promoted this vision energetically, pushing it at international gatherings where the great questions of standardizing time were hashed out. And remarkably, the idea won. The world gradually adopted a version of exactly what he'd proposed, and the framework of standard time zones became the invisible scaffolding of modern life. The reason you can look at a clock in one country and know precisely what time it is in another, the reason schedules and flights and calls across the globe hang together at all, it's the perfect note to end on. One man, mildly inconvenienced by a single late train, refusing to shrug it off, and in his stubbornness, quietly rearranging how all of humanity keeps time. So as you finally drift towards sleep tonight, watching the minutes tick gently by, remember that the orderly march of these very minutes across the globe traces back, at least in part, to a slightly grumpy Canadian who missed his ride and decided the entire world's clocks needed sorting out. And so, our long, strange wander through Canadian history comes gently to a close. What a peculiar country it turns out to be beneath all that politeness and snow. Tonight, you've met a woman who walked 20 miles through enemy woods and ended up on a chocolate box, a soldier who took a bear to war, a prime minister quietly asking his dead dog for advice, thieves who made off with a lake of maple syrup, an explorer who ate his own boots and then, unbelievably, went back for more, wild horses on a sandbar, a monster with a silly name, a jet too beautiful to be allowed to live, and a country possibly named by accident because two people misunderstood each other over directions. It's easy to laugh at all of it, and you should. But underneath the absurdity is something quietly moving. These were real people, muddling through freezing winters, brutal journeys, hard choices, and long odds, usually with no idea they'd end up as history at all. They built, they blundered, they endured, and every so often they did something so strange or so brave that we're still telling the story a century later. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your warm, safe bed, with the heat humming softly and the door safely locked, maybe spare a small, sleepy thank you to all of them. The dreamers and the drifters, the stubborn and the ridiculous, the ones who hauled a ton of bacon up a mountain, and the ones who simply refused to give up. History, it turns out, is far stranger and far more human than any story we could invent. Rest easy now. The lights are low, the world is quiet, and there's nothing left to do but drift off. Good night.